Welcome, everybody, to the Ecosystem Podcast. We're your hosts, collaborators. What else do we do together? We probably can't cover everything, can we, on this show?
Probably
not. It's not long now till we're going to all be in Slovenia, of course, having the time of our life at Dynamics Minds. I heard the event's almost fully sold out. It's going to be epic. If you haven't booked your ticket, there's no excuse like it's too far to travel, because I'm coming from the bottom of the bloody world, and it's a long way for me to travel. And I'm going to be leaving my two kids, one being 3, one being 1.5, with my wife for 10 days to do this epic journey. So please come along to Dynamics Minds and hang out with us. Will is offered to record a podcast at the event, or here's something about a dinner and a show. I don't know what that's all about, but that could be entertaining.
We have our panel that we're doing.
We have our panel at Dynamics Minds. Anyhow, this has been the longest introduction. Andrew, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so I had a message from one of our listeners, and he was talking to me about, and I'm looking here, I'm going to kind of paraphrase this message, but he was talking with me about how one of the recent episodes got him thinking beyond the day-to-day life in his work with Power Platform. In his case, he's a consultant for Power Platform consultant. And he was talking about how basically he spends a lot of time arguing with customers about how much data versus storage capacity they need. And the conversation developed a little bit. And I asked, are your customers, not thinking particularly deeply about this? And he said, some of the larger ones are. But to give you an idea of scale, our largest customers, and he's in New Zealand, our largest customers in New Zealand would be SMB, or small, medium business, by US or EU standards. And as we went on, I thought that this was really, really interesting and brought up some interesting questions about scale when it comes to how the technology, how cloud technology and Microsoft technology specifically is used, particularly in different economies where you have different population dynamics around scale. So I pointed out, you raised this really interesting topic. I'm an American living in a country about the 5th the population of the United States. He's an American living in a country much smaller than the United States. So I thought we could talk a little bit about how geographic variation and population variation and the different dynamics in business culture are impacting cloud ecosystems around the world. Interesting.
Because it's been something that in the last 3 years has become abundantly clear to me in the understanding, particularly of people out of North America and or Europe, and their understanding of the geography of the world and the smallness of things below the equator. And I'm not referring just to myself here when I talk about smallness. What I'm referring to is let me just show you quickly here on screen an example, just so for those of you that are visual, you can see this. If you're listening to the audio podcast, go watch it on YouTube if you want to see the...
Bandages can now be applied on wet skin thanks to new technology.
Forget the most popular section. Look at this. Here's the Northern Hemisphere. Here's why it's home to 90% of the world's population. This is at 2022. This number is still only 10% of the world live below this line here. And look at little New Zealand. It's tiny AF. What you have here is a very low number. It's about 10% of the world's population live down here. Now, you play that forward into business, that means 10% of the deals in the world that are very large are down here. And that's all these countries, right? So, because I used to work for a very large global company, they would always talk about, well, you need to add more zeros to the deals that you're doing. You need to sell larger. We're not interested in $1 million deals. Only bring $10 million deals to the table when we're talking about the Power Platform. And I'm like, so I called this guy particularly on this. I said, how many Fortune 500 companies do you believe are in Australia? Oh, well, at least 3. I said, well, the concept of Fortune 500 is actually a US only measurement. And so there's none. None are headquartered or fully owned or operated. Yes, we have provincial offices from those large corporations in these countries, but they're not the decision-making arm of the business, right? When it comes to $10 million IT spends in building solutions. So I just wanted to ground that for everybody around this question that's coming from Nathan about the discussion on sizing. Andrew, back to you.
I think to just drive this home, one of the things that I think is very difficult for those who live in maybe an incredibly densely populated place. So Europe is incredibly densely populated. I believe actually the EU has a larger population than the United States, though maybe without the UK, it drops below. But if you come from Europe, or if you come like me from the northeastern United States, I don't think it's hard to have a real concept of density, right? So Australia, for example, is an absolutely enormous place. This is something, by the way, that Canadians certainly will understand, right? But Australia is an incredibly large, vast place that only has 24 million people living in it, right? So that's basically the population of Romania or the population of New York State living on an entire continent, right? And I think that you see this I'm just going to carry on with Australia, right? You see this in some of the non-technology business dynamics, right? So Australia is dominated by two airlines, right? Qantas and Virgin Australia. I believe that Australia has a higher concentration, kind of market share concentration in a few grocery companies, right? Because if you think about it, 24 million people just doesn't give you the population to spawn multiple large competitive airlines. And that's not to say anything for New Zealand, which is 5.5 million people in terms of population. If New Zealand were a US state, I looked this up, it would be the 24th largest state. There would be 23 states larger in population than New Zealand.
Yeah. Just expanding on that, just to give you like in New Zealand, we have one national airline, and they go after this whole thing of support local, support your local. The problem is they're the most expensive airline to fly in and out of New Zealand. Just a case in point, right? I just booked my tickets yesterday. Now, when I say I did, my wife did, to the Power Platform conference in Vegas. Right, later in the year. I'm coming. Meg's not coming, unfortunately. Someone has to look after the children.
Leave the small one with the 3-year-old.
But you got that robot that cuts your grass, right?
Yeah. It's don't get me started on my mower. It's just the most epic thing ever. Anyhow, we went through. So I have air points. I have status with that airline. I log in and I go to book the flights, and for whatever reason, we got distracted, time out, we went back, and of course the flights had gone up, surprisingly, the identical same flights, which was a code-share flight with United Airlines, right? So United Airlines fly in and out of New Zealand, and it was a code-share flight. And I was like, when I was living in the UK, I'd set up an account with United Airlines because I was flying, across the Atlantic. It made sense. I hate British Airways with a vengeance. And so I was like, let's just try it. The same flights on United. They were $300 cheaper than booking through my local statist account.
Like New Zealand dollars or real dollars?
We're talking real dollars, cheaper.
Real dollars.
Than
okay, all right.
Booking through our local airlines. And this is the thing, when countries have monopolies on things, even like airlines, honestly, it doesn't matter that you're, it's about looking after your citizens or your fellow countrymen or anything like that. They screw you over. Anyhow, my little side rant.
No, I think that's actually that's very interesting. And I wonder, and I don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
But does that dynamic in the market for anything, right? New Zealand's got one national airline. I don't know how many grocery store chains New Zealand has, but Australia has this, like I said, this high 2, right? So does that dynamic depress innovation in some way, or does it change the calculus around technology, technology-based modernization, right? We don't need to do A, B, and C to modernize. We don't need to make this kind of investment because, well, why? We don't have a competitive pressure to do so. I don't know if it does or doesn't. I'm curious, what do you guys see?
Yeah, well, there's two things. There's a mindset as well that goes with it. So I chose some years ago not to work for New Zealand companies. And the reason is that it's like extracting teeth. Every little price point, they want everything for free, right? They want the best technology. They want to pay for it. And this is where.
Oh, they're perfect for Power Platform then.
Exactly, right? It's this whole, it's a mindset of being a miser, right? And for me, I've been indoctrinated enough with American mindsets in a way that, about being optimistic, about the opportunities out there are just yours to behold, right? It's the American dream. And I suppose from my years ago being indoctrinated with Amway back in the day that I bought into this concept. And so now I find it very hard to work with New Zealand businesses. I find it very hard to make New Zealand dollars. I'd much rather earn USD, euro, or, pounds, because it seems like for the amount of work and the return on investment is so much better working in the Northern Hemisphere than it is in the Southern Hemisphere.
I will say, though, if we were going to go down this road, we probably should not have chosen airlines as our point of departure, because if anyone has ever flown on a US-based airline or gotten a glimpse of the nightmare that are their computer systems, then airlines are not where technical innovation thrives.
It's an interesting point he was making about monopolies, though, because let's face it, as soon as you have a monopoly on anything, it absolutely, it restricts competition, it increases prices, and it lowers quality. Even we wind back to the invisible hand of the free market of Adam Smith, he even stated back then in the Wealth of Nations book that monopolies do not equal success, and they harm not just the overall economy, but all the advancements you can make, as well as then the consumer wealth from behind it. So, it was an interesting point to bring up, although what I'm trying to get to is how we relate that back to Nathan's question.
Yeah. And let's wait till Andrew comes back on and to get some clarity around what the core of that question is and how do you address it. But it's an interesting thing you bring up there, is that because every time I see either the government divesting its assets and going, let the free market decide, it never, ever, ever plays out to support the person on the street, right? I mean, look at UK water. The story behind UK water now, I think it's owned predominantly by investment companies, and it's gone through the roof, right? The price of water in the UK. Andrew, we were trying to get back to the question from Nathan. What is the core question that we're trying to discuss or unpack?
Yeah, so as I read on here, we talked a little bit about the dynamics around population, but so now what's interesting to me is how one might turn the entire thing around. And this is something that I told Nathan. I think that there could be an opportunity, right, to say, listen, we're lucky in New Zealand because we can focus on taking this amazing tech and doing something of quality without the headache of having to scale the thing to 100,000 employees, right, to 100,000 people. Mm-hmm. I think that this was harder back in the day when technology was less accessible, right, when the engineering, when you basically had to hire an army of engineers to build a lot of this from scratch. But I just think it could potentially be such a cool opportunity. Pick the largest New Zealand company in any major industry and say, listen, nobody else is doing this. You have an opportunity to use Azure plus Power Platform plus Fabric to run away with the prize. And I don't know, I just think that would be such a wildly cool thing to do as a CIO.
So there's been cases of that. There was a company called Green Button in New Zealand some years ago, and they adopted Azure straight away for compiling video footage. And I'm talking about movie footage, right? And Microsoft acquired that company and built it directly into the platform, into the Azure platform, because it was an amazing piece of tech. And definitely there's the ability for innovation. and I don't want to just shit all over my country, but one, we don't have a government system that really.
I love New Zealand.
I love it. I live here because the vista, the landscape, the fact that I can go to a beach in the morning with my kids and the beach is a kilometer long and I'm the only person on it, right? It's just epic. It's just, that nature piece is amazing. But if you want to earn serious coin, you've got to be working on projects outside of New Zealand. I don't know. I don't, where I've been contaminated by working internationally enough that I have expectations that are higher than what I believe the New Zealand market can do for me. And businesses in New Zealand, we have a thing called New Zealand Trade and Enterprise that take New Zealand businesses offshore. Like we've got Rocket Labs, right? They're sending rockets into the atmosphere in New Zealand, right? Random in that whole aerospace area, and they've done extremely well. And then, of course, VCs come in, and then they're all owned by BlackRock at the end of the day. So these companies.
It depends how globalized these businesses are, right? So if we're saying their actual market is domestic, it's different than saying actually they're they've spawned into this multinational conglomerate. Yeah. And that means that actually it's not just New Zealand, it's all the countries they're in. And that's the difference, and this goes back to when we were saying, the monopoly conversation. I built on that a bit, Andrew, while you was away, saying that actually having monopolies can be absolutely detrimental, but at the same time, if you are growing your business out, you become incredibly good because of the innovation, then monopoly also naturally occurs. So that's why this argument of capitalism, free market, that is always up in air, and it always will be.
Well, this is a challenge that I think, and I love these episodes that we do where we branch out from being, from strictly talking about the tech. These are some of my favorite episodes, by the way. But if you look at this phenomenon, it manifests in some interesting ways, right? And it's all about what I think economists would call the internal market, right? So the United States is I think the quintessential example of a big internal market. And I think historically, right, as the one American on the podcast, right, I will say that there's an alternate history where things could have turned out very differently, where essentially the United States would have been a collection of independent nation states, similar to Europe, right? But that's not how history turned out, as we know. And today, the United States, part of the reason for America's economic vitality is that it has an internal market with 400 million people and almost no trade barriers between the states, right? And you see in Europe where the EU has tried to emulate this and has had some success. It's certainly easier. European companies certainly have a bigger addressable internal market today than they did a generation ago, or certainly two generations ago. But you do have some friction in trade between those countries, and you have friction in language as well, right? If you're going to make a product that is not obvious in how to use it or is in any way dependent on communication, you have a language barrier in some cases. And then you have countries like China, right, which is so export oriented. And there's been a lot of talk in amongst economists and in the press about this over the last year or so, as China has faced a bit of an economic downturn, and they've tried to double down on exports without actually stimulating the vast consumer internal market of over 1 billion people that they have. Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting dynamic for sure.
I think these setup of trading zones in general has, if you look at the history of them, it's absolutely fascinating. So the history of Europe, actually the US was tightly involved in that for a long time as well. We look at dial it back to the Bretton Woods Agreement, where everything was where everything was traded back to to New York, and the fact that we had a load of gold sitting there, and all of a sudden Germany's economy took off, the automobile trade took off, and they ended up imbalancing that system. They weren't the only reason, but they were a huge contributor. If you look at actually half the reasons behind, Europe and how that evolved from us meant to be able to trade cotton and agricultural goods, and now all of a sudden it's become this huge thing which it was never meant to be. But I cannot think of one system that has happened in the era of capitalism that has actually worked out well. That has worked out truly well, because there's always imbalances in systems, and I think there always will be. Sorry, you triggered a thought in my head as soon as you started talking about Europe and America, and I thought I went straight to Bretton's Woods, so I dialed the history way too far back. Yeah,
I should say the reason that this conversation on LinkedIn between Nathan and I got struck up is he listened to our most recent episode where we actually kind of stayed mostly away from the tech, and we talked about the big societal implications for AI. And his original message was, hey, I just got the latest 2 episodes of Ecosystems. In the AI chat, you sound a lot like a guy who is 2 years away from announcing his campaign for the US presidency. And so these are wide-ranging conversations, which is why I love them.
Andrew, it's funny he says that, because there is something you want to announce around that, isn't there?
Not. This is not like the time I started Cloud Lighthouse, though. Mark recently left his role. Are we ready to talk about what Mark is doing with himself now, or next episode?
we should never talk about what Mark is doing.
Never talk about. I think we're an episode away or so before we talk about what I'm doing now.
We ripped the curtain off, or I don't know. What is it? What are we doing?
Drop the sheet. Yeah, whatever.
Drop the sheet.
Yeah, it's maybe one more, but yeah, it's interesting, because even jumping into this back, you mentioned AI then, and of course it's my massive focus area at the moment. And I've heard a soundbite recently around education, right? Because education is going to be transformed by AI, and how we educate, particularly. And when I talk about education, I'm talking about adult education. I'm talking about our children, right? So I'm particularly looking at it from having a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. And of course, they go to daycare at the moment. They're learning so much, but they're going to be going to school. And we know that the classroom ratio sizes, generally 25 students to 1 teacher in New Zealand is the ratio sizing. And the data shows that the more 1-to-1 you can tutor an individual, their EQ goes through the roof, their ability, their skill levels, all that kind of stuff accelerates in that scenario. And of course, what AI is going to give us, in the future, is this very 1-to-1. Now, it's going to probably get messy for a while as everyone goes, no, we shouldn't use AI in education. Everyone goes, no, we should. And there's going to be ups and downs and stuff. But the soundbite that really hit me was that if you took the entire schooling curriculum, and for whatever country, I don't know if this is different per country, the quote was coming out of the US, so it was based on the Carnegie schooling system, right? He was one of the big proponents of education so that he could get workers for his plants and factories, educated workers. And is this whole thing that the schooling term from 5 years old to, in our case, is about 18 years of old before you go to university, is that all that could be done in 20% of the actual time, that education process, if you had a much more 1-to-1 type case of training. And so in the world of AI, so like the way this in my mind goes, whoa, hang on a second. I would never, ever considered homeschooling my kids, as in, because I just think that's for crazy people.
A line has been drawn in the sand.
So what I mean, it's for people that are kind of very like, oh, we don't trust the education system. They're going to talk about sex in a way that I don't like sex to be talked about. This is the type of stuff that I've seen. Or they're very religious, and therefore they want to make sure they're going to indoctrinate their kids correctly. So what I'm saying is that all of a sudden, like, I'm going, hang on a second, Meg and I still want to travel heaps. We've got whole continents that we haven't explored yet.
How much traveling do you want to do? Heaps,
man, heaps. Sweet as, bro, sweet as. And so I'm like, hang on, what about if we took that model that we decided to take our children's education into our own hands? And she was like, oh, yeah, but what about their social interaction? I mean, my gosh, let's say we're in Vietnam. They're going to learn to play with Vietnamese kids, right? They're going to have massive, it's not like we're going to stay in a resort or anything. We're going to stay in the general populace in any of these type of travels, that we do. I think you could bring up a generation that are, one, massively critical thinkers, brilliant at math because you could have the best math tutor training them at any time, English, French, any type of language. I think that we move into a world where the richness around education, I think, is going to explode and go through the roof. And therefore, that changes the whole dynamics. And this is one of the things I'm challenging myself with, is the concept of the 9-to-5 job or the work week, which come from the Industrial Revolution. And I think, Will, it goes into an area of, work-life balance, which we want to bring up on another show. And really, it's about life. How do you live life? How do you make good money so you can support your lifestyle? But also, how do you really enjoy life? And
what is life for?
Yeah.
But the other thing that I think actually is one of the reasons why I love you all on this podcast is because I think we're all very good at that, which is looking at traditional paradigms and almost ignoring them and going, well, how else can we do this?
Exactly.
Say, right, yeah,
exactly.
You want me to, I'm born, I've got to be the family person, I've got to go to school, I've got to go and get a job, I've got to go to university. Actually, why do I have to? And what's a better way of doing that? What's a better way of doing school? What's a better way? That's why I love digital nomads. I love that that's become a thing, which everyone's like, I can work from wherever I need to. I've got my laptop in my bag. I'm touring. I'm going everywhere.
I will say, and Anna and I talk about this. So we talk about this all the time. So I am a U.S. citizen living in the United Kingdom. Anna is a Romanian citizen, also a British citizen living in the United Kingdom. And I say all the time, the world was not built for us.
Yeah.
Right? The world is incredibly administratively cumbersome to navigate for those living in a country that is not their own.
Oh yeah,
so
true.
But Mark, let me ask you. So, and I'll share my answer in a moment. But think about, you cannot say your beautiful island home, right? Mm-hmm. I cannot say my beautiful home on Cape Cod. But where is someplace in the world that you've been that, if the paradigm that you're talking about were different, where would you live? Where would that be?
Italy.
Yeah. If the question was addressed to me, then I would have said absolutely similar, Mark. And it's funny that you've gone to that. So why?
So I think we've traveled to 40 odd countries now, Meg and I, and before Italy, it was Portugal. It was 100% I'd go to Portugal, and specifically Porto in Portugal is where I would live.
I didn't like Porto.
Oh, I love Porto. I just amazing. I got to hold myself back from saying stuff that would get me in trouble about Porto.
It's not like you.
Yeah.
All right.
But anyhow, so definitely Portugal, as in, was my first. And then, but the thing is, I'm saying this with only 40 countries. Isn't there around 200 countries in the world? Like, I've not even scratched the surface yet.
But you can only base it on your view of what you understand.
Yeah. And that's definitely Italy. And now, keeping in mind, I've never been to Greece, but Italy.
Will, what about you?
So I've been to Greece, and that's I haven't done 40 countries, but I have been to Greece. So I'm going to take that one off, Mark, and take that as a point. I've been to some very interesting countries. So I've been, to from war zones to all the way through to Europe, which I love. And one thing that I know you two know about is I hate flying. I have an irrational hatred for flying, and it's a fear, and it's only come to me since I've been doing sort of more holiday travel, which I think is just bizarre.
You need to get some ayahuasca in you and get them to deal with that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm dealing with. I've got 3 different flights coming up over the next 6 weeks, and I'm pumped for it. One's tomorrow, actually. I was on the way to Color Cloud.
Will, I thought about you when
baby.
This was last month. I flew across the Atlantic Ocean 4 times in 10 days.
Oh,
in a 10-day period, 4 of those days were spent flying across the ocean. And every time I thought of it, I was like, oh, I wish Will were here.
Because he'd be screaming me to sleep.
Yes.
No, and I love Europe, and I like Europe because it's almost familiar but more perfect. So, there's the people kind of understand your humor, that, culturally it's the same, but so different. And it's just beautiful. But I went to Italy, And I think who I went with helped. So I went with my girlfriend and actually my foster mother. It's the first time I've ever taken her away, and that was quite a special thing. But I went to a place in Italy, in Tuscany, which not many people visit, called San Gimignano.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this old medieval town in, high up on a hilltop. And everybody, they knew their place in that system. And they all had their routine, and they all got up, and the food was amazing. The people were amazing. The people were friendly. They were happy to talk. They were happy to give you the best food, the best drink. And I just loved it. I just thought this is a place where I could absolutely live, and I'd probably live for longer than if I lived in the UK. I'd probably survive longer. There'd be less stress. There'd be less epigenetic factors tearing down, my nucleotides. Yeah.
That's how I feel about Spain.
So, Spain's for you?
Spain is for me, but in order to add some variation here, I'm going to go south and say that Anna and Alexandra and I spent 35 days in South America last year. Anna was on maternity leave. I could work anywhere, and we brought Alexandra when she was 8 months old. And one thing that I found is that Buenos Aires is. And that whole time zone is actually an amazing time zone because you're in between New York and London, right? Wow. So my favorite time zone to work from is definitely, I don't know what the time zone is called, but it's the one that contains Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I would move down there in a heartbeat. I think what holds, and Mark is going to laugh at this, what holds me back from doing something like that is that, oh my God, every time I got to go see someone in person, it's a 14-hour flight to anywhere. Like, you're just every time. I don't know if I could do that.
That is valid, but like what you do is go, okay, let's say I'm going to do that time zone only once a quarter, right? Mm-hmm. And you pack it out what you do in that once a quarter, because I mean, honestly, I just find that so. What COVID did for us is make this ubiquitous, right? That people don't expect to, be in a meeting room with you, in a boardroom with you all the time anymore, or they don't even want it. Don't want it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's a podcast in itself, isn't it? Which is hybrid working. Doesn't work.
Man, let's. I'd love to pull that apart. As in, that's such an interesting topic.
That impacts your work-life balance as well.
Yeah, massively.
Removing the commute, removing the interact. Yeah, I think there's a lot of ground to cover there.
I've spent more time with my kids in their young life than I reckon my father ever spent with me.
Really? So there's some really interesting research on this topic now that Anna and I have been looking at as we navigate parenthood ourselves. And I don't know the exact percentages, right? But it's something like this. The typical, and the numbers are different for men and women, particularly because 2 generations ago, the disparity in parenting duties was so vast, right? So you have to look at moms and dads separately here. But if you look at, the typical mother today who has a full-time job spends more time with her kids than the typical stay-at-home mother 2 generations ago. And it's astonishing. And I think that, and the same is true for fathers, but if you look at the data, it doesn't take much to spend more time with your kids than fathers 2 generations ago. I don't think that's particularly valid, but it's fascinating data.
But the dynamic has changed as well. So we must remember that actually, and I'm going to say it how it is, because I think it's the appropriate way to say it, which is the role of the female within our world is being corrected to where it should have been a long time ago. Yeah. And that is having a huge impact, the correct impact. I sat through a lecture on the gender pay gap the other day, and it's insane that we have to have these sort of meetings, but they are the right meetings, the right lectures to attend, and the best things to understand. So that will have a play in the dynamic on top of all the work-life balance, on top of the people having kids first, the people not, and on top of the values, belief systems that have changed significantly due to the increase in education. There's so much there to unpack.
It's an interesting thing, and this is a really hot topic right now because many countries, across cultures and across geographies, many countries are really wrestling right now with what they, what demographers would call the total fertility rate, and that is, on average, how many children are born to the average mother, and replacement rate is about 2.2, right? So in order for a society to not to grow, but to replace itself, every mother needs to have 2.2 children. I don't know how the 0.2 child, how that works out, but
it's very messy.
It's very messy.
Yeah.
But in any
arms
case,
and legs.
one of the ideas that I find very interesting is that if you look at countries that really invest in supporting parents, and in particular supporting mothers in the workplace, right? To your point, you can do it. You can make these sorts of national investments and dictate your public policy by a desire to increase the total fertility rate, basically to encourage the having of children. But historically, that has not actually been very effective. And if you look at countries like Sweden, the whole orientation of the policy is not to increase the number of babies, but to actually make it more possible for mothers specifically to have fulfilling careers and participate fully in society and in the workplace. And I think that's a somewhat a lost distinction on a lot of people, but it's what is our purpose? Is our purpose to have more children, or is our purpose through a policy or through an investment?
Depends if you're asking Richard Dawkins or not, right? The Selfish Gene. Go and read it, guys.
Yeah. Well, this one has been wide-ranging.
Yeah, been interesting, and I think we've got some good topics for other discussions like that. The work-life balance, the hybrid work. I think we could do an individual episode on each.
The evolution of society in general, I think between us it would be quite. But we'll have to bring out a different sort of branch of podcast here, which is old men ramble. It's.
Can I give a shout before we sign off? I just want to say that I chose this wine glass. This is our second episode that we're recording today, and it's 10 o'clock at night. I chose this wine glass specifically because this was a wedding gift from the famous Janet Robb. And they are lovely. They are lovely, and we love them, and we use them all the time. So, Janet, if you're listening, thank you so much.
Well done, Janet. You mention her name, and it just takes me back to Belfast. Anyhow. Ciao, ciao, ciao.
Bye, guys.
Cheers all.